Hello, and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Planet Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld, and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Sarada Krishnan, Director of Programs for the Crop Trust. Sarada has an undergraduate degree in horticulture, master's degree in horticulture, and PhD in conservation biology. Before joining the Crop Trust, she served as the Director of Horticulture and Center for Global Initiatives at Denver Botanic Gardens for 16 years. Sarada is responsible for providing oversight on the implementation of strategic projects and programs designed to support the Crop Trust mandate of securing the world's crop diversity. Thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thank you. So I'd love to start with learning a little bit more about the Crop Trust. So what is the Crop Trust and what type of work does it do?
Yeah, we are a nonprofit international organization, and our mandate is to conserve crop diversity and make it available for use globally forever and for the benefit of everyone. And the way we do it is through an endowment fund. We have an endowment fund, and from the income earned from investment of that endowment fund, we distribute it to genebanks around the world to ensure that the seeds, the plants that they're conserving is protected in perpetuity.
Perfect. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you became interested in this type of work?
Yeah, I growing up in India. The horticulture degree in India was about the bigger concentration was fruits and vegetables, whereas in the US, when you talk about horticulture, you think about ornamentals and landscape plants. Whereas many of the developing countries, when you talk about horticulture, it's about fruits and vegetables, spices, plantation crops. And my family, growing up, my family was an agricultural family in India. We had, my family had coffee farms, paddy, rubber, all sorts of agricultural products. So I think even growing up, I had an interest in plants and agriculture. So from my undergraduate degree in horticulture in India, I came to Colorado State University and did my master's. And then for my PhD, I did a little later in life when my kids were a little older, but I wanted to get back into the roots of horticulture. I was still working at the Denver Botanic Gardens. I wanted to focus on something that had economic importance to farmers around the world. And so I concentrated on coffee. So I worked on coffee genetic resources. Working in Madagascar has about 60 species of wild coffee. So I focused on the conservation of, there is an XC2 gene bank in Madagascar, which was established by the FAO back in the 1960s. Looking at the 4 of the 60 species, I worked on 4 of the species, looking at the genetic diversity of what is conserved ex situ, which is outside the natural habitat, and also in situ, where in the natural habitats, I went and collected leaf samples and made a comparison to do conservation recommendations. So that was my PhD work. So that's how I got into coffee research and also been interested in agriculture and ensuring that to develop a sustainable system that will help the livelihoods of farmers.
I love that. So what ended up attracting you to the Crop Trust? Like, how did you sort of discover its work, and what led you to want to work there yourself?
So in 2016, the Crop Trust was developing the global coffee conservation strategy. So they contacted World Coffee Research, and at that time I had done some work for World Coffee Research, and I was at the Denver Botanic Gardens through the Center for Global Initiatives. I was able to continue my coffee research work. So World Coffee Research contacted me and asked me if I would serve as the lead coffee scientist on that project. And that's how I worked very closely with the Crop Trust in developing the coffee conservation strategy. So that's how I knew of them and they knew of me. So when this position opened up, it was a great fit.
That's exciting. And what does your day-to-day life kind of consist of now with the Crop Trust? Like what types of projects and initiatives do you tend to work on?
So, under my portfolio, manage the endowment fund. We give endowment fund funding disbursements to all the international collections. Those are all the international gene banks that come under the CGIAR centers, the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research. And so these are international, there are 13 international gene banks, they have specific mandate for certain crops. And so they are the ones we support. And then we also have do projects where we work with national partners because international gene banks have specific crops that, like International Rice Research Institute, they work only on rice. And then there is the CIMET Gene Bank in Mexico, and they work on maize, corn, and wheat. So they have very specific crops. So, but national gene banks, every country has their own national gene bank. It's usually under the Ministry of Agriculture. So national gene banks, they conserve the diversity within that country for the people. So they have so much more diversity, but a lot of these national gene banks are underfunded. And so that's why through our projects, we work with national gene banks to mobilize capacity to ensure that they are following international standards, because all these seeds that they conserve have a shelf life. So if you don't conserve in proper conditions, if you don't do proper germination testing, you don't do viability monitoring every few years, you need to make sure, and if the viability is going down, you have to regenerate and replenish your population and seed population. So that is the thing, is we work with these national partners to mobilize capacity to ensure that they are following all of these standards, so that way they don't lose this valuable resource.
That sounds like it's very important to help preserve all of these crops and help the countries do that to the best of their capacity. So
Yes.
how was the idea of the Crop Trust developed, and like how was the organization created?
So, even though the gene banks are effective, so there is the long-term operational cost of conservation of collections. It's rarely secure, or it doesn't have a sustainable footing. So many gene banks, even the most important ones, the funding cycle, it's not reliable. They can have funding one year and not funding that year. So in 2004, under the auspices of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, we were established on behalf of the CGIAR gene banks to develop a sustainable system, a global system of funding for these gene banks. And that was when the endowment fund was established. So at that time, we had done a costing study of all the gene banks and what the essential operations, it's just not research, nothing, but the operations to ensure that the seeds are conserved in perpetuity. And so for us, we need $850 million in our endowment if we have to fund all the global gene banks, but which is not a very big investment to make, because when you think it's our food, right? If we lose that food and the diversity, what do we have? So globally to invest 850 million in a food system is not a big ask. And so, but we have not gotten there yet. So that's how we were established. We were established in 2004 in Rome, and then we moved our offices to Bonn, Germany in 2013. So since 2013, we have been in Bonn.
Now, what are some of the other important aspects of the Crop Trust history? Are there any other kind of key dates or key things that happened since it was founded?
Oh, since it was founded, I think, the founding itself was like how it was the FAO, like in 1996, we needed a global coordination of the world's crop diversity. So they had organized, the FAO had organized a conference with 150 countries participating, and they developed this global plan of action to coordinate all the efforts to halt the loss of diversity of our crops. And so that formed the global plan of action, formed a pillar of which has become that, and from that came the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And all the countries are signatories of the international treaty, and we call it the Plant Treaty. So they have within the Plant Treaty, there is what we call Annex 1 crops. There are 64 food and forage crops that fall under this Annex 1, which is a multilateral system. Because it is, for us now, the food is like a global common public good. The crops are like maize, it's all over the world, even though it originated in Mexico. Potato from Peru, everybody eats potato. And coffee, it was from Ethiopia, but everybody grows coffee. So it is a global public good. So it is under the multilateral system, so that way it is accessible to all who need it. But not all crops are under there. There are so many crops that countries won't share their genetic resources because it is their national heritage. So the treaty was developed to protect these collections that are housed in these gene banks, and so they needed a mechanism for the stable funding, and that's how we were established in 2004. So since then, I know in collaboration with the Norwegian Ministry of Agriculture and Food and with the Nordgen, which is the Nordic Regional Gene Bank, we are the third partner, established the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. So from a historical standpoint, that was a milestone in our history where the Svalbard Seed Vault was established.
And now you've mentioned that there's an endowment that helps maintain a steady source of funding. So what are some of the funding sources of that endowment? Like, who helps to fund the work that the Crop Trust is able to do?
A majority of the fund to the endowment has come from governments, and the US government is one of our biggest contributors, along with Norway and Germany. And we have funding from New Zealand. A lot of the different governments have support the endowment fund. So we include, and then also civil society, which are foundations. We have private sector. We have the Seed Association, farmers organization, or individuals can also contribute. But majority has been so far from the governments.
That's great. That's really important to have the government strongly supporting this, but have ways for other people to contribute too.
Yeah.
So what is the Food Forever strategic plan for 2030? And what are some of its aims and objectives?
So that's a strategic plan, and it is a plan for the next 6 years with a goal of to permanently secure key collections of crop diversity so that we can create a viable global system of gene banks and also help make this diversity available for use. So it's not just enough for us to conserve it, but we also want to ensure that it is being used, because without use, what is the point of conservation? So we have so many complex interconnected challenges these days, especially with climate change. And, climate change is huge, as well as conflicts in areas. We've seen, like last week, I was in Sweden developing a strategy for the Ukrainian plant genetic resources. Now and post-conflict, what will happen? How do we ensure that they are conserved? And Sudan is another challenge. So yeah, Ethiopia, we need to look at all of these areas of conflict to ensure that we don't lose that genetic diversity from these collections. So there are so many challenges, pests and diseases. Every day there are new pests or diseases that are happening, and with climate change, it gets exacerbated even more. So that was why the strategy, the strategy was like, over the next 7 years, where do we need to go to ensure that this global system is protected? And so we identify 3 key results area. The first one is our endowment fund. So we really need to raise the funds, and we need to ensure that we are funding all these international collections. And also within the endowment fund also comes the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. So the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the way it serves is, it is like what we call a black box. Once you put the seeds in, it's not taken out. It's like secure as a backup in case you ever need to go and get it, and which has happened once before. And I can talk about that too. But so as when we look at standards, international gene bank standards, we want to ensure that all the seeds that a gene bank is conserving is protected. There are 2 more levels of safety duplication. One within the same region or in another international gene bank is the first level, preferably outside of the country. And then the Svalbard is the second level. So that way, in case the country loses its genetic resources and the first backup also fails, then you have the second backup. So it's just the security. So that's what we ensure, that Svalbard is there to protect that. So we also fund the operations of Svalbard. And then we also call what we call system-wide services. That is, so gene banks, data management. If you don't have data on the collection, nobody knows what you have or what characteristics are in the accessions that you are saving. So data management is something that we offer. So we have a information portal called Genesis that we operate, and you can go in there. All the gene banks have input data, so you can look at it. So all the gene banks, when they do their as one of the operations is also characterization and evaluation. So characterization is plants. You're looking at the characteristics of what is the height of the plant, or all of these different, there are some descriptors that you follow, and which is very useful for a breeder. A breeder is looking for a certain characteristics for breeding, for trait development. So that's why the data management is very useful. That is a service that we provide. And also quality management systems. So we help gene banks develop standard operating procedures for all their procedures within the gene bank. So we have different levels of conservation, collecting, risk management, all of it, we have a quality management system. So that also we provide training to all the gene banks on how to manage the gene bank. So that is a long-term support that comes through the endowment fund. And then we have time-bound support. The second key results area is the time-bound support for upgrading, for collecting, and for use of the crop diversity. And that is the projects that we do with all the national partners. So that is time-bound. It is when we get funding from, like we currently have a project called the BOLD project, funded by the Norwegian government. So BOLD stands for Biodiversity for Opportunities, Livelihoods, and Development. And there we work with so many partners in building capacity and also providing infrastructure and equipment and training. So that is the time-bound support. And then the final key result area is increased global awareness of the importance of this crop diversity, because we want to be an advocacy organization for the gene banks and the importance of conserving crop diversity. So so that is like through communications. We do communications, and we also train our partners in communication, because within their own countries, they need to learn how to communicate so that way they can be effective within their own governments to get funding or for whatever purpose to bring visibility to the importance of crop diversity. So those are the 3 key results area of our strategy.
And now you mentioned that you were working on preserving, I think you said around 64 different crops are priority crops. Could you tell me a little bit more about the types of foods that are part of that list and maybe how they are selected?
So the 64 Annex 1 crops, that is under the international treaty, under the multilateral system. So that was actually selected by all the governments. So there's the governing body of the plant treaty, which is all the countries that are signatories. So it came about through consensus from all the countries. So the crops were selected. So now they're looking at expanding the number of crops that will be, but it is a very charged topic because of which crops do you add, which means that the countries lose the control over the crop. So that is the 64. I think should be online under the International Treaty website. So a lot of the major staples, like you have rice, beans, maize, wheat, sorghum, and all of those, a lot of the staples, potato, most of the vegetables are not there. I'm not sure if tomato is in there. So, but yeah, a lot of the vegetables, some of the vegetables and are all in there, and the forage crops also.
Now, you've mentioned the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I'd love to hear more about what that is and what happens there. And yeah, maybe a little bit more about that time when you were able to go back in and retrieve those seeds.
Yeah, so right now there are about 1.2 million samples of seeds at Svalbard, and there is capacity to store up to 4.5 million samples. And almost many countries have seeds in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And once you put the seeds in, it is under the ownership of the country. Nobody else, like if some country put their seeds in, another country cannot come and retrieve it. It is the ownership of the country that put the seeds in there. And so it is like they only open it 2 or 3 times a year, February, I think June. And so nobody can go in. It's only there, the operations, the seeds come there, and then they go deposit it, and then it's closed. And then they monitor the temperature and all of that. But other than that, it's not a functioning, what we call a black box. It is a black box storage. And so it's kind of is the ultimate insurance policy for our food supply. And so what happened is, and so it's about, for seed storage, there is the short-term, medium-term storage, and long-term storage. So when you are in a gene bank, you have the medium-term storage is where you pull, if you want, somebody asks for seeds, then for distribution, you take from the medium-term storage, and then you have your long-term storage. So the medium-term storage is about like a refrigerator, maybe about 5 degrees Celsius or so. And then the long-term storage is minus 18 degrees Celsius. And so that is what is maintained at the Svalbard. So even if the power were to go off, because it's in the permafrost, it will still keep it cold. So that is the whole reason why it was established in Norway, Svalbard. So an example of when it was retrieved is the ICARDA gene bank. ICARDA stands for International Center for Agriculture in Dry Areas. And they conserve a lot of from the Middle Eastern, like lentils and chickpea, wheat, and all of that from the Middle East, Near East region. So the gene bank was in Aleppo, Syria. And then when the civil war happened, the scientists had to leave. There was a lot of bombing and shelling and all of that. And so they had to abandon the gene bank. But fortunately, they had backed up all the collection in Svalbard. So the ICARDA, what they were able to establish 2 different gene banks, one in Morocco, in Rabat, and one in Lebanon. And so they established these gene banks. They were able to retrieve these seeds that were deposited in Svalbard, and they were able to regenerate them and bring back their seeds back into the gene bank. And now they are safety duplicating everything back at Svalbard. So that's a great example of, like in a conflict area, if you didn't back up, that would be like, and that's the center of diversity for wheat and these crops, chickpea and lentils and all of that. And so they have all the diversity from that region in the gene bank. And if it had not been backed up, that could have been diversity that could have been lost forever. So that's why we were able to bring it back, regenerate it, and now we are safety duplicating it back there.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And it's, yeah, so good to hear that Svalbard exists so that the genes can be backed up and the seeds can be preserved even in times of conflict. So how does the Crop Trust source the seeds for the seed vault? Are they getting them from farmers? Like, how does that process work for actually picking the best seeds to preserve?
So we don't source the seeds at all. It is the gene bank. So as part of their performance targets, one of the things is safety duplication. And so when we tell the gene banks that they need to meet the performance target of 90% of their samples need to be safety duplicated. So they need to, when they do the safety duplication, they have to have a viability of at least 80%. So they have to do the viability testing. Anything that before you put into storage, you test for viability to make sure that it has 80%, and only then it is sent to the seed vault. And it's packaged in aluminum foil bags and airtight, so that way it doesn't get degraded. And so whenever we work on projects in countries, that is one of the requirements. When we give funding, there'll be funding for safety duplication. So under the BOLD project, there was one of the components of the project was safety duplication, one of the what we call work packages. So we worked with about 50 or 52 centers and we provided them with equipment and capacity training on how to do regeneration, how to do packaging, and all of that. And they had to. So this was like. Sometimes, in a seed bank, they may have seed sitting, it is not stored properly, not viability tested. And through this project, we were able to raise the standards within those gene banks and actually educate them about what needs to be done to keep up and clear all these backlogs that they had for viability testing. And then, so with those partners, we have been able, that is one of the things, is we want at least 40,000 samples at Svalbard. So that we are working with some smaller gene banks. There are some university gene banks, even community seed banks. So for that, we are working with different groups of people, and that project ends at the end of this year.
So what are some of the other supporting gene banks? Where do they exist? You mentioned universities and communities. Could you tell me a little bit more?
Gene banks are all over the world. I mean, every country has its own national gene bank, and they may have different centers based on, because, some of the crops that cannot be conserved as seeds have to be like a sweet potato or a coffee or tea. They cannot be conserved as seeds. And so they are what we call field gene banks. And some of them, like potato, they can also put them in tissue culture and then put them, the second level of safety duplication would be like in cryopreservation instead, because they cannot go to Svalbard. Svalbard is only for seed crops. But for clonal crops, we need to find another, cryopreservation. But for that, and in between is like a slow growth tissue culture or in vitro culture is what we are looking at. So a lot of the gene banks are located, almost every country has their own gene bank. And most of them are under the Ministry of Agriculture. And then sometimes universities have gene banks, or like the community gene bank. One of the things, and in one of our safety duplication project under BOLD, we were working with a community-driven effort in Suriname. It was the Maroon community who had come from Africa. I mean, they were brought here during the slave trade to Suriname. And when they had come, at that time, they had brought their rice with them from Africa. And that was very precious to them. And they were growing it in their community. And so we worked with them to ensure that those seeds are protected and safety duplicated in Svalbard. So that was a community that we worked with to ensure that that history and the culture is not lost. So that was one of the examples of supporting a community.
What are other special projects or research the Crop Trust is working on?
Other projects, so we have the BOLD project. So there are different components within the BOLD project. So the one is like the first component is we are working with 15 national gene banks to build capacity. So we did, when we are working with these gene banks, we first do a review. We hire external experts who do external review to see what condition are the gene banks in. And then they come up with a list of recommendations for improvement. So then we work with the gene bank to create a plan on how to improve the gene bank and to improve the conditions of the seeds and to ensure that the seeds are maintained at high standards. And so that's one of that. And so we're working with 15 centers, national partners on that. And then there is a pre-breeding component. So we used to do a project on crop wild relatives. It was a 10-year Norwegian funded project. And that ended, and then it continued as BOLD project. And there we have, we are working on 7 crops like alfalfa, grass pea, durum wheat, barley, potato. So there are 7 crops that we are working with on pre-breeding. So through the crop wild relative project, where we had used the crop wild relatives in breeding programs, and we are continuing that pre-breeding project. And then is seed systems. A lot of times from pre-breeding, and then if you develop a variety, if you don't have a seed system in place, it's hard to get to farmers. So we are working with the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, NMBU, on the seed system, development of seed systems project. And that's in Bhutan, Uganda, Tanzania, and I think Ecuador that we are working in. And then the other work package was the safety duplication with 52 centers that we are working with. And then we also have a communications component and awareness raising. So where we are, not only we promote what we do, but also we build capacity of the gene banks, the 15 partners that we are working with. We provide them tools on how to communicate their project and the successes from their projects to their wider public within the country. So that's a Boulder. And now we have a newer project, which we are calling Boulder, which is working with nutritious and underutilized crops. And because a lot of the countries, I mean, we've become so homogenized in the food that we eat. But there is so much diversity out there, which we are not consuming. And so that's where with the Boulder project, we'll be working with 4 countries, and 2 in East Africa and 2 in West Africa, because Africa has such rich diversity in food crops. And so working with underutilized, and it'll be a participatory method. We will select we are just starting the project. We will select the crops based on farmer and other wider stakeholder input. And then we will work on it until 2030 to develop. And so there'll be different components: market development, seed systems development, some breeding to ensure that the crop needs to be, uptake by the farmers. We need to ensure that there is improvement to the crop, because a lot of these crops are probably not domesticated. So I think that's something that we will look at. So that's the Bold and Boulder project. And then we have the Seeds for Resilience project, which is coming to an end. And that is a German government funded that we are working with 5 African countries in building capacity and upgrading the gene banks. And then we have a crop conservation strategies project that is also German government funded. And last year we completed the project. We developed 15 new crop strategies, 15 strategies. And now we are working with the international treaty to see what might be entry points within the treaty and the crop strategy. How do you have the strategies? How do we implement? What is the next? How do we take the strategy to the next level? And then the last project we have is the Darwin sweet potato project funded by the UK government Darwin Initiative. And that's, we are working in Madagascar and Zambia, and where we collected land races of sweet potato from farmers. And the sweet potato, the problem is they're very prone to viruses. So we need to clean them. When you go to all these countries, anything that you see in farmers' fields are probably infected with viruses. So what we did is with the SIP, the International Potato Center, which is based in Peru, they have a facility in Kenya also, in Nairobi. So we collected these land races, sent it to Nairobi, and they cleaned it out of these virus by putting it in tissue culture, because you take the meristem, the shoot tip, and then you cultivate it, and the meristem does not have the virus. And then they repatriated it back to the countries, and the gene banks, the FIFA Manor in Madagascar and Zari in Zambia, they grew them all out, and now they're distributing it to farmers. So this is the third year. We are just starting the third year of the project. So that's another for non-seed crop, a clonal crop. That is one of the projects that we are doing. So these are our major projects that we are involved in right now.
Wow, these are all truly global efforts.
Yes.
What are some things that everyday people can do to preserve seed and crop diversity?
I think we need to diversify our diets. So, I mean, it's easy. We just have potato and, I'm vegetarian, but even in my vegetarian diet, you just are used to a few vegetables. But there are so many other leafy vegetables that are nutritious, and so many different fruits. And so I think we all need to be open about trying new vegetables and fruits. And I was actually last year at Costco, I think 2 years ago. When I went to Costco, they had rambutan, which I don't know if you know the rambutan fruit. It's from Southeast Asia. And my grandma used to have it in Malaysia, in her backyard. My grandma used to have rambutan in her yard. And I loved rambutan. And so I was so thrilled to see, I'd never seen it other than Southeast Asia. I'd never seen rambutan in a US market, and Costco had it. And when I go to Costco, I'll pick up 2 or 3 boxes. So, those type of, but then when people see it, if you don't know the crop, you're not going to try it because you have no idea what it is. So I think we all need to be open to these new things in the market, or go looking for new things in like specialty markets. You go to an Asian market or a Latin American market and go look for new things like Opentia, cactus, or whatever, and try cooking with them. So I think I would say that we, we need to, for our own health and nutrition, we need to diversify our diets. And also, I think that's what I would tell people.
I love that. That's great. Everybody should go in with an open mind.
Yes.
Are there any other things that you would like to share?
I think, I think you have covered pretty much a lot of things in a short time. But I mean, there are, farmers, climate change is really you can see the impact in farmers' fields. When you hear like drought and farmers lose entire crops. And when you have only one cropping season and you lose a crop, that is a huge impact on the livelihoods. And I think we all really need to be appreciative of farmers do. And even if we have to pay a little extra in the market for a crop, if it goes back to the farmer, I think we should all be open instead of looking only for the cheapest vegetables in the market. I think, and so, yes, and farming is not easy. It's just, and people really need to understand they need to go and work in a farm. I think everybody should work in a farm to really understand what farming is and where your food comes from. I think that's so key to really appreciating what you eat.
Thank you so much for joining on the podcast today. It was really wonderful having you, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.